Environmentalists are deeply and bitterly divided into two camps, the Greens and the Grays, and they are constantly fighting with each other.
The plan would represent loss of green space.
Tree loss.
Our green space.
I have to speak for the trees.
These are the Green Environmentalists. They're fighting to save the trees and to stop housing and density from destroying the green space in our cities and suburbs. And then we
need more housing.
Per person emissions in a multiplex are lower.
Sustainability is not just maximizing the color green.
This is a good move for the environment.
These are the Gray Environmentalists. They're fighting for new buildings and denser housing to stop sprawl from destroying natural areas beyond the city. At the local level in Minneapolis, you have environmental organizations like the local Sierra Club butting heads with the local Audubon Society. Both proclaim to be environmentalists, yet they are diametrically opposed on the exact same issue, with the Sierra Club supporting increased housing density and the local Audubon Society suing the city over the exact same thing. So what's going on? Why is housing tearing them apart? And who's right? In the 1950s, suburbs were exploding. Every day, thousands of new homes were built, and people celebrated this growth.
No matter how you add it up, California is enjoying record prosperity.
Compared to the death and destruction of the two wars preceding it, and with the Great Depression still a recent memory, this growth felt like a miracle. Every family had a home, every house had a TV, every child had a pony. For many, it seemed like there was no limit to this era of prosperity. But there were some downsides to that rapid growth. Suburbs were spreading quickly. Across the nation, 3,000 acres of land was converted into suburbs every day. That's the size of about 35 San Franciscos per year that we paved over for more sprawl. Activist Jane Jacobs described whole counties of rolling land being swallowed in repetitive suburbia. Each day, the bulldozers munch farther outward from the cities. These catastrophes sparked the rise of the environmental movement. Conservation groups like the Sierra Club joined forces to take on rampant deforestation, sprawling development, and industrial pollution. Joni Mitchell really captured the whole vibe here, weaving together pollution,
Hey, farmer, farmer, put away that DDT now.
and sprawl.
They paved paradise, put up a parking lot.
Activists rallied together, banning DDT, saving the redwood forests, cleaning up the Hudson River. But for those deep in the environmental movement, there was a realization that the fundamental source of all of these ills was humankind itself, in that more people meant more destruction of the earth. The population question is inseparable from conservation. But that population topic wasn't really a popular one. It didn't get mainstream attention until 1970, which is when the book, The Population Bomb, captivated the nation.
There's 3.6 billion people in the world today, and we're adding about 70 million a year, and that's too many.
The book made its way into living rooms, landing on the Johnny Carson show multiple times. It's hard to overstate just how much it captured people's imaginations. Its message was terrifying.
We can no longer afford merely to treat the symptoms of the cancer of population growth. The cancer itself must be cut out.
The mainstream battle now wasn't just about pollution and sprawl anymore. It was against the unchecked spread of humanity itself. And overpopulation became a radical new rallying cry for a movement seeking to save the planet.
When you go back into the Sierra Club archive, they're talking about overpopulation as something that needs to be addressed at the level of the United Nations. But then they are also talking about how do we get our local chapters engaged in this issue. One way that that case is made is by saying there are ways that we can fight overpopulation in our own backyards. And then those bulldozers that are in your backyard start to take on a kind of new and deeper meaning to you. It's not just, oh, I don't want more neighbors. It's not just, oh, I can't deal with the noise or the traffic. It's that these bulldozers represent something that is really sick about our society.
These environmentalists saw rolling hills transformed into a panorama of skyscrapers. They saw grassy pastures covered with miles of highways. They saw blue skies blotted out by smog. To them, there was no starker image of overpopulation heralding the downfall of nature than this. So environmentalism morphed into a movement that sought to block construction and local development even within cities, all in the name of halting what they saw as the looming catastrophe of overpopulation. The same people who once celebrated population growth and economic prosperity a decade before were now doing everything that they could to stop it, to protect their corner of the world from the very expansion that had once seemed like a dream come true.
Join us at 11.
Pieces of office equipment.
Contact the Sierra Club today and learn how to help. Your kids are counting on you.
Now, by the time we get to the 90s, environmental groups like the Sierra Club were starting to abandon their anti-population growth positions. Blocking development projects locally didn't really have the desired effect of stopping population growth. It just displaced that growth. Those places to live just got pushed elsewhere.
We should take Bikini Bottom and push it somewhere else!
But as our understanding of the environment changed, so too did our priorities.
We simply must halt global warming.
In the 90s, you start to see this focus on climate change as being maybe the overriding environmental issue of our time. Every environmental organization, in every aspect of their work, they now ask themselves, how will this affect climate change?
The focus shifted to how to do the least harm with the population that did exist, to minimize environmental impact on a per-person basis. And to do that, they turned towards density. Building up and not out became the new strategy. And this was a complete 180 from previous strategies. This wasn't about stopping population growth anymore. It was about making sure that the growth that did happen did the least damage possible. I'm gonna take a quick detour here to tell you about Hiro Onoda. I promise you it'll be related. In the last few months of World War II, Japanese Lieutenant Hiro Onoda was stationed on a small island in the Philippines. When US forces attacked, Onoda went into hiding, and soon after, the war ended. But when Onoda received leaflets announcing the end of the war, he denied it, thinking it was merely enemy propaganda. For nearly 30 years, he stayed hidden on that island, surviving on coconuts and the occasional stolen cow. All the while, he believed his mission was still active. In his mind, the war had never ended. For many people steeped in the activism of the 1970s, environmentalism was fighting the good fight against private developers and opposing any new construction. So when many environmental groups shifted focus in the 90s and 2000s, embracing urban density, they couldn't believe it. They still see themselves as the true environmentalists, opposing density, standing up against developers. But now, the movement that they once belonged to is saying that they're the bad guys, calling them names like NIMBY. NIMBY. Just as Onoda kept fighting the US in the name of Imperial Japan, well after the rest of Japan had made peace with the US, the Greens are still fighting urban density in the name of environmentalism, well after the rest of environmentalists have made peace with urban density. This shift in priorities created a deep schism in the environmentalist movement. One side views urban density as inherently destructive to the environment, whereas the other views it as essential to its salvation. So who's right? Well, both are kinda, it really depends on what you mean by the environment. There's the environment that refers to things like the ozone layer, climate change, ocean acidification, coral reef bleaching, rising sea levels, greenhouse gas emissions. Basically, the global environment. These are not things you really see on a day-to-day basis. This is what the gray environmentalists focus on. It's more about averting global catastrophes. And then there's the environment that refers to things you do see in your neighborhood. Are there trees on my block? Am I breathing smog? Is that apartment blocking my sunlight? This is what the green environmentalists focus on. It's more about maintaining the environment you live in, the vibes of the neighborhood, and your local quality of life. Like the environmentalists of the 1970s, they want to preserve the nature that they see around them, and they do so by opposing local development and mandating low-density housing patterns. To them, protecting their neighborhood is protecting the environment. And if they can do that, well, then mission accomplished.
So what do you do to protect the environment in cases like this?
The ship was towed outside the environment.
Into another environment?
No. It's been towed beyond the environment. It's not in the environment.
And if they do reflect on the global environment, they look at maps like this and they see terrible patterns stemming from cities. The red, basically where the major cities are, have the highest total emissions. And it sends a pretty clear message. Cities bad, countryside good. But it's not so simple. So let's first look at what the Greens get right, and then at what they get wrong. So for what they get right, whether it's sunlight, trees, stormwater, heat islands, the local environment and local quality of life does matter. For example, too much asphalt produces a heat island effect. This is a NASA map of urban heat islands, places where there's so much asphalt that the temperature can be 7 degrees hotter than surrounding areas. They also care deeply about trees and biophilic design, and this can do a ton for the local environment and how livable your city is. Tree-lined streets can be 5 to 15 degrees cooler, nearly eliminating that heat island effect. Living among nature has been shown to reduce stress, and cars drive much more safely on streets that are canopied with trees. A single mature tree can absorb about half an inch of water from every rainfall, and that can be as much as 100 gallons of water per tree. They also pay for themselves. In Portland, a study showed that the presence of healthy street trees adds $15 million to annual property tax revenues, while only costing about $1.3 million per year for the city to maintain. That's a payoff of nearly 12 to 1. It's a pretty good investment.
If the city planners have their way and create more density, we are faced with grave pollution.
Now we're gonna take a look at what the Greens get wrong. So here's the thing, if we don't densify, we multiply, which is to say that if we don't allow urban centers to grow denser, then all the people who would have lived there instead move farther out and contribute to even more sprawl, thereby multiplying their negative environmental impact. So let's focus in on 3 key areas: carbon emissions, asphalt, and deforestation. Let's look again at that map of carbon emissions. If we look at it instead on a per person basis, the colors totally flip. Dense cities have far lower carbon footprints per person. And from this perspective, despite all of its gray, New York City is one of the greenest cities in America. It's kind of funny because living in New York City doesn't really feel like living in harmony with nature, but in many ways, it is green. The average New Yorker consumes roughly 1/3 of the electricity of the average Dallas resident, and ultimately generates less than 1/3 of the greenhouse gases of the average American. So why is that? Well, for one, with denser populations, there's more use of mass transit, walking, biking, and there's less car ownership and trips, which cuts pollution and reduces carbon emissions. Apartments also tend to be more energy efficient with shared walls, which reduce the need for heating and cooling, and thereby reduce emissions. To make up for the difference in carbon emissions between the families in one apartment building versus one suburban subdivision, you would need to plant over 49,000 mature trees. Next, we have asphalt. Denser cities actually have less asphalt per person when compared to the suburbs. The sprawling suburbs of New Jersey have 3 times the amount of asphalt per person as nearby cities like Hoboken and Jersey City. For that reason, even the EPA says higher density development is a better way to protect water resources like rivers and lakes and streams, noting that higher density development produces less runoff and less impervious cover than low density development. Here's another way to think of this. Here are 2 ways to build 100 homes on an island. When we build 100 single-family houses, we end up with way more asphalt and way more impervious surface than what we get with 100 apartment units. And that brings us to our next topic. Trees.
Trees.
Trees. Trees. Trees.
With the apartment building, sure, there's less green in that exact area, but you leave the rest of the island untouched. Nature in its wilderness. When you build the 100 houses on their own private lots, you take up way more of the island, clear-cutting way more trees. But let's say the island looks a little more like this, and there's a proposal to build an apartment right here. Yes, it does mean that we lose some trees on that exact lot, but it saves way more trees elsewhere. So while it looks eco-unfriendly to take out those trees for an apartment, the environmental implications would have been far worse if we hadn't. So let's say instead we didn't build that apartment. The people who would have lived there don't just disappear. Instead, they move farther and farther out, pushing into wetlands, forests, and conservation areas. Suddenly, we need to widen the highways and lay down more roads, and we just dramatically increase traffic and carbon emissions. So when you look at the big picture, cutting down a few trees for denser housing can save the environment from a much worse fate. The key thing that the Greens get wrong when they block density for reasons of environmental impact, whether that be to reduce asphalt or carbon emissions, energy usage, deforestation, habitat destruction, whatever else, they don't actually prevent that impact from happening. They do prevent it from happening in their hyper-local area, sure, but it inevitably gets displaced to be somewhere else. And all that asphalt, carbon emissions, deforestation gets multiplied when our cities can't be densified. So we want trees, we want a high quality of life, and for the sake of our global environment, we also want to minimize suburban sprawl. Can we do all of that? Well, there are a ton of examples of density gone wrong, but there are also ways to do it right. Since 2006, Austin has not only grown its population by well over 200,000 people, it's also increased its tree canopy by a third. This study actually found that within cities, there wasn't really much of a relationship between density and tree canopy at all. Here's an area of San Francisco with low density and low tree cover versus an area with much higher density and also much higher tree cover. And there are plenty of cities all over the world that have increased their density and maintained or grown their tree canopy. There's Curitiba, Brazil, and Barcelona. There's Vancouver, and then there's Singapore. Many of these places also sit near the top of quality of life rankings. As the authors of the tree canopy paper wrote, an urban world that is both green and dense is possible if we choose to do it. Let's break this down. The greens and the grays have different objectives or different goals and different strategies to achieve those goals. The grays' main objective is averting global climate catastrophe, and their strategy to do that is through high density living. The greens' main objective is local quality of life, and their strategy to do that is through low density housing patterns. And to be super clear, the grays aren't forcing people to live in high density housing. It's simply allowing the option for people to do so. But in contrast, the greens are banning high-density housing options, effectively forcing people to live at a lower density than they would have otherwise chosen. We can't do both strategies. Banning high density and allowing high density in the same area is clearly incompatible. So we have to choose one. So what strategy do we choose? Now, we know it's possible to allow high-density housing and achieve a high local quality of life. So that means that the greens' objective is compatible with the grays' strategy. But it's not possible to ban high density and preserve the global environment. If all of humanity lived like we do in low-density sprawl, then a global climate catastrophe would be all but inevitable.
An essential strategy for reducing urban-related carbon emissions is supporting dense mixed-use communities.
Ultimately, there are completely understandable lifestyle reasons to oppose density in your city, but you cannot in good faith oppose density on the basis of environmentalism. You cannot in good faith oppose density on the basis of environmentalism. It doesn't really matter how many trees you have on your street if the entire world is burning. So the Greens have to get on board with the strategy of permitting higher density, and the Grays have to cooperate with the Greens in ensuring that this doesn't negatively impact our local quality of life. Here's the kind of depressing part. 3 in 4 Americans believe it's better for the environment if houses are spaced further apart. It probably stems from the feeling that this seems more environmental than this. But it's the exact wrong idea. The Greens have been very successful at blocking upzoning and additional housing using the very environmental laws from the 1970s to sue the projects and policies that they don't like into oblivion.
Plans to grow and restructure the city of Minneapolis are on pause after the demands from a 2018 lawsuit on environmental transparency were granted.
When presented with some proposal to build new housing, the Greens always ask, what are the environmental impacts of building housing here? But they never ask, what are the environmental impacts of not building housing here? And the latter almost always exceeds the former. Blocking density is almost always more destructive than permitting it. We are literally missing the global forests for the local trees. When I ran for city council last year, the local Sierra Club ended up endorsing my campaign, in part because of my stance on housing. And then because of that, some green environmentalists said, oh, the Sierra Club isn't really pro-environment anymore. That local Sierra Club also came out in favor of upzoning and increased density in Arlington County, Virginia, and some long-standing members actually fought that stance and appealed to the National Club and then lost. And consequently, they ended up revoking their membership in protest and calling the leadership in the Sierra Club greenwashing political hacks.
There's complete disregard of the environmental impacts of the radical upzoning.
You will be creating heat domes,
further degradation of our environment,
more greenhouse gases,
increased carbon emissions,
adding a great deal of cement,
environmentally destructive density,
Godzilla stomping around and destroying homes and trees.
We live amidst a rapidly escalating climate crisis. Sacrificing our tree canopy in order to gain more housing options is not in the public interest.